Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. A charity law report found that in 2023, 67% of all revenue going to Canadian charities comes from government. So a potential change in government with new policies and mandates can cause significant uncertainty among many nonprofits about their future revenue streams. Federally, the Liberal minority government has already faced multiple non-confidence votes in Parliament, and more are expected, so a snap election could happen at any time in the months prior to the required election in the fall of 2025. Provincially, the Ontario government is widely expected to call an election in the next 6 months, while BC and New Brunswick has just gone through elections that signal a major shift in political support in those provinces. In the face of such uncertainty, what can Canadian nonprofits do to better prepare their organizations for a potential new government? Are there any steps that they can take now to insulate their operations and revenue streams from the turbulence of government uncertainty? To discuss these important issues, we're joined by Christopher Holz, Principal of Campbell Strategies and Government Relations Advisor for capitalW. Chris is a seasoned public affairs executive with over 20 years of experience working with government decision makers and clients. Providing counsel at all three levels of government, he has served private sector clients, citizen groups, charities, and nonprofits in several policy areas, including financial services, energy and utilities, real estate and infrastructure development, healthcare, municipal government, environment, among many others. In addition to his consulting experience, he's previously served as a senior advisor to several Ontario cabinet ministers, including the Minister of Energy, the Minister of Finance, and the Chair of Cabinet, providing his perspective on both sides of the government relations. Welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Thanks very much, Mary.
Well, let's kick off by acknowledging that this is a real time of uncertainty in Canadian politics. What kind of impact does an election and a potentially changing government have on nonprofits and charities?
Well, that's a great question. So what I would say is it certainly can have a significant impact. And it doesn't matter what our political views might be, but change in government can create some opportunity for charities and nonprofits and business folks and others. But it can also be a challenge in the sense that, a new government may have different priorities where we may not fully fit with the frame that government's elected. So I think it's really three things that we need to think about with any change in government, whether it's a provincial or federal government or municipal government even. And those three things are, a change in policy or programs or priorities for that government. The second one, though, is around funding. And so when I say funding, I'm talking about the kinds of grants and contributions that many charities and nonprofits will rely on, where a new government may have a different priority list or different kinds of program ideas or restructuring. And then the third one would be a lot of the fee-for-service programs that governments deliver, meaning many charities and nonprofits deliver services to clients on a fee-for-service model because the government relies on those nonprofits and charities to deliver that service. So that can be another area where that changes because there's a change in government and maybe there's a change in the priorities or how programs are delivered. So those are the three areas. But it could be opportunities for charities, absolutely. Even a most fiscally conservative government, there may be opportunity, but it can also be a challenge. And so that's the key message.
And from your perspective, what's the current landscape in Canada when it comes to upcoming elections? What's on the horizon? Maybe you could give us some, context and color.
So there's a lot. So one of the interesting things, and this happens occasionally, where there's such a large number of elections that are taking place. So nationally, we all know that there's a period of, call it sudden death, because the NDP have withdrawn their support from the Liberals. So there is a possibility of an election almost at any time. And so when I say that, there are 8 confidence motions every quarter, every 3 months or so. Every one of those is a potential where the government might be defeated and then an election is triggered. There's other things happening in Ottawa. We'll see, in the days and weeks ahead. But provincially, there are a number of provinces that also have elections that are underway. So we've talked about British Columbia and New Brunswick. Ontario may be within the next 6 months. Good chance that there will be. Saskatchewan's in the middle of an election right now, end of October. So there's a lot that's happening, and that's a bit unusual for businesses, but also charities and nonprofits, in that there's so many that are taking place in such a unique period of time, that any change is, like I say, an opportunity, but in some cases can be quite a challenge for charities and nonprofits.
Well, as you say, the sector is often quite concerned about the possibility of a change in government, especially after a prolonged period with one party in power. What are some of the general impacts that nonprofits and charities might expect if there is a change in government at the federal or the provincial level?
So one of the big ones, I think, is, let's just look at the federal government for a moment. So it has been, it's a liberal government with NDP support for the last several years. Um, I'm not talking about political opinion research, but if I did for a minute, the conservatives have been way ahead of the liberals and all the other parties for quite some time. That's not a one and done. That's been like for 10 months. And their vision is, as we might expect, is quite fiscally conservative. No party has fully put out their platform, and that process is literally underway right now. But the expectation, at least at the federal level, is that there will be some significant changes in priorities. And candidly, there probably is going to be a reduction in funding that has been available for things like grants and contributions that charities and nonprofits rely on, or some of the program areas where we currently provide a lot of funding may be changed fundamentally, because there's a different vision for how that program should be delivered. And that might impact fee-for-service models that a number of charities and nonprofits rely on. So that's an example at the federal level. And similarly, I think at the provincial level, potential changes in government, whether we're talking out west in British Columbia, out east in New Brunswick, or here in Ontario, all changes in government potentially have great opportunities for charities, but can certainly be a threat in the sense that a government's priorities may be different, and therefore there may be fiscal or funding consequences of that. So we need to be mindful of that.
So they have reason to be concerned and anxious, I imagine, is really sort of the message here. What do you recommend to organizations in terms of how they navigate this change? Are there things that organizations can do internally before even beginning to engage in government relations work? Like, how do you start this process of especially if you haven't been very active in it before, perhaps creating one from scratch?
Right. So I think the first thing, before you pick up the phone and call anybody or for the first time ever, or if you have a robust government relations strategy that you're already using, that's great. But the first thing I would say is put all that aside and really like assess what's happening. What's the big picture? Like, so in the context of elections and when they're coming, um, I think the best way to think about it is this: like, let's figure out where the money's coming from first. If it's from government, that should be our key priority. Let's look at the context, the different parties that are looking to potentially form government, what their priorities are, what things they've said. That's helpful. And how do we fit? Are we a charity or nonprofit that has significant outcomes? We have a huge media profile. We have a number of clients that we touch on. Or, are we very small? We're not well known. We might have a relationship with our local representatives, maybe our counselor, maybe our MPP or MLA or MP or what have you. Let's figure out what we have, what our relationships actually are or aren't, and then figure out, what is the best approach. And I would say simply there's two things. So in this unique time frame, developing a strategy is the number one thing for sure. But the second thing is, with the time that's available, I think there are probably two objectives. The first is engaging with parties that may form government, maybe because there's an opportunity to provide some input into like a platform, or at least to build a relationship with the candidates that may be our local representatives. That's something that's really important, and especially if we can get to the stage of something that might even be in a platform, that's ideal and that's great. Secondarily, or almost at the same time, is building and maintaining our relationship with civil servants, those that are the ones that are responsible for our contribution agreements, those that are the folks that that we have to report into, that demonstrate here's where the public money went, and here's what we were able to deliver against this agreement. Building that relationship and maintaining it is just as important. Why is it important? Because at the end of the day, those civil servants are the folks that are putting that material into the briefing binders for a potential new minister and a new government. Those transition binders are very, very important. And if we're able to build the case that our organization is delivering great outcomes, that we're dealing with a really, really important issue in our region or province wide or nationally, um, some of that content may get reflected in the briefing transition materials that a new minister and a new government will get for that area or that portfolio. So both things are important. But before we pick up the phone, the number one thing to do is to figure out what is our strategy? What do we have as an audit? What is our greatest strength to be able to engage? If we've got issues, let's address those issues first before we start picking up the phone and contacting decision makers.
So is that what is meant by the concept of funding due diligence? Is that the concept of how organizations can better understand what's happening with their own funding before, I guess, setting the stage for what their next strategy would be to build relationships with government?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the phrase "follow the money." That means something else, but in the context of charities and nonprofits, what it means is we need to understand where our funding currently is coming from and how reliant we are on different funding sources. That really should dictate our priority list of who we're paying attention to, but also things that we need to really think about to diversify our revenue so that we're not solely dependent on 60% of our funding coming from this one source. Because goodness gracious, if something goes not in the way that we want, there may be significant impacts for our organization. So that due diligence is in part about understanding where our money is coming from, and we all have a sense about that. But the real thing is to transition that to then if 60 or 50 or whatever the percentage is, if a significant percentage is coming from this one particular source, we should be spending that amount of time on maintaining and building that relationship. And at the same time, being conscious of we can't be solely reliant on this. We need to ensure that we have a diverse series of options for funding to deliver the programming that we do as an organization. And organizations that figure that out can do quite well in these regular periods of potential changes in government. And those that don't maybe are at the mercy sometimes of where a government has a fundamental change in policy or program, maybe cuts in a particular funding area, and there can be consequences. And there's a stacks in this office that demonstrate that.
So I'd like to, I guess, get down to some, I guess, logistics. When is the right time for organizations to ramp up their government relations work, especially in the context of a situation where there's an election on the horizon?
That's a great question. There's no time like the present. So I would say, the earlier you can start this process, the better it is. Having said that, in my experience over a long time, while that's true, even in the midst of an election campaign, it's possible to get platform commitments delivered, communicated by parties that are running under the very right circumstance, and it's not easy. But so in other words, all I'm simply saying is this: the earlier you begin, the better. But even the election period can be an opportunity to get a platform commitment or a commitment by a party to do something, and that's in the context of government relations. From a civil service engagement perspective, I would say now, right until the point when the writ is issued, which is when the formal election period begins, is really the time frame that exists. So if we're talking federally, not predicting the immediate future and the very next confidence vote, but there's weeks or months. Good chance that this government will last at least until the holidays, maybe beyond that. Watch everything change tomorrow. I would just simply say, from a civil service perspective, the opportunity to engage is basically now until the writs are issued. And the value of that is ensuring that you have a relationship with decision makers in the civil service, those that maintain the contribution agreements that you rely on, because 35% of your funding comes from that department or ministry or agency. But also because the content of that discussion, of that material, may be shaped, may be included in the transition briefings that are developed for a potential new government or new minister. So that's really important. So both things are happening. There's an opportunity now to do both, but with respect to the civil service component, it ends when the writs are issued for elections.
And in a practical sense, how should organizations go about getting those meetings? How can they really best position themselves to get the attention of their officials?
So the number one thing before any of this begins is really having that strategy, like doing that assessment, that SWOT analysis. What relationships do we have? How are we perceived as an organization? Are we delivering well on our mandates, on our contribution agreement? Are we a chronic problem where we're constantly delayed or whatever? Like, that is really, really important. From a practical perspective, it comes down to, for smaller organizations, your executive directors being the folks that often are leading this, perhaps with the support of board members, which I think is always a good idea. Sometimes also with program staff, because it's not just that they're on the front lines, but they have often very detailed knowledge and experience that is useful for the contents of meetings. From a practical sense, yes, it's emails to sometimes folks that you don't know very well, requesting the opportunity to meet. And absolutely, I would basically recommend this. PowerPoint is great and has its own challenges, but the value of a PowerPoint presentation is that everybody on the team for the organization has a clear understanding of what we're trying to communicate. At least going through that process will help, because those discussions are limited in time. How limited? 30 minutes. So in 30 minutes, you've got 20 minutes really to communicate something that's very important to you. And it's one of 400 things that the recipient, the civil service, the ADM for this particular division, or the chief of staff to Minister so-and-so, they've only got that amount of time. So 20 minutes to deliver that presentation, 10 minutes for discussion and questions. And really, are we tracking? Are we getting buy-in from these decision makers? Are they committing to doing something with us? Are we agreeing to deliver something if this happens? That's important. That's what happens, and that's the time frame that I think that we need to be mindful that we have. It is limited. So
It's actually very helpful for people to understand that, because, and I imagine that rehearsals are really kind of helpful too, just to be able to condense that important information down to 10 minutes and be prepared to answer the questions is really kind of what you're suggesting, right?
yeah, that's absolutely right. Rehearsals, for sure, and having the messaging like really, really concise, so that you can deliver what you need to deliver, and you can also set the context for why it is that you're talking. So knowing the context and communicating the broader context is actually probably the first, before we get into the specifics about why us, why we're talking to you, whatever the issue is, and what our solution is. So, or what our ask is. Those things, that frames really every discussion that I've ever had in government. I've been doing it a very long time. I've been a recipient of those discussions. I've certainly done more than my share of those types of meetings. But if you can do that and frame that discussion and get it in 20 minutes so that 10 minutes is left for discussion, then you're in a good place, because you're going to hopefully have signals throughout that discussion, and certainly signals in the questions and answers, and the discussion at the for the remaining 10 minutes. That's important.
So how can organizations be mindful of political realities without engaging in partisanship? I assume that that's the appropriate tone to take.
Yeah, absolutely. So, being aware of the positions of parties doesn't mean that we're participating and using that language in meetings with them or meetings with civil servants. That's not what we're talking about at all. So I think, from a practical sense, for like smaller charities and nonprofits, and larger ones, certainly, I mean, it is paying attention to media. It is paying attention to media that's relevant to the policy space where you operate. I think having a sense of the bigger picture political things is helpful, but also the ones that are very specific to your policy area is important. Um, so, when we get to the point of platform commitments, sometimes platform documents, we used to have things like the Red Book and the Common Sense Revolution for Ontario listeners and other platform documents, and those often are still out there. But what you'll also find is that there will be commitments where the leader of a party is committing to do something, and that is the equivalent of something that is in the platform document, or the deputy leader, or the minister of health, or the chief critic for what have you. Like, all those things are opportunities for platform commitments, and so being mindful of them, especially the ones that are relevant to us, I think is really important.
And is it important to align your mandate or your mission to what the policy might be, or at least in fashioning the message so it makes sense to the new government?
Well, okay, so if we're talking now on the other end, a new government is elected. Um, I think it's sales 101, right? So know your audience, know who you're selling to, and that means understanding their headspace. It doesn't mean that we have to surrender all of our values as an organization. And I'm not saying that whatsoever, but I'm saying that we'll be more successful if we at least understand where they're coming from. We may vehemently disagree. We may actually see an opportunity to reshape what we do because it fits that narrative. We might be much more successful in generating revenue by doing that. I'm not, I'm completely agnostic to whatever the government is or what the party is. It's more about, can we be creative enough to envision ourselves in that frame? Because if we can, we can be quite successful. If we can't, then there's a number of other things that we need to do, that maybe compels the government to change its mind or to reduce or slow down what they're proposing to do. Um, that's those are fun campaigns too. I've done lots of those as well. But I would just say that one is easier, one is harder. Both can be successful, but you know, we need to be mindful of the longer term of what that can do.
Right.
So I hope that answers your question.
So you're talking about, say, I don't know, you take a public stand that might embarrass the government potentially in order to sort of, I don't know, persuade them to see things in a different light or take a different direction.
Yeah, I mean, so let's just talk about that as an example. Like, there's lots of examples in the media on a daily basis where that's out there, and sometimes that can be effective, especially if it's sustained, and it gets worse or it gets more stronger. Um, but I would say there's probably three times as much there are three times as many examples that you've never heard of that it didn't work. So that's not to say don't do it. I think what it is to say is, like, recognize that governments can be in power for a long time. And I think what's helpful is to be creative and, like, how can we fit that frame? That, to me, that's actually the most creative part. And I'm not saying it works for every organization. And I'm not. It doesn't matter what party is in power. Like, I could talk about the Chrétien liberals, a couple decades ago. We could be talking about the current conservative government here in Ontario. We could be talking about Justin Trudeau. It doesn't matter. What I'm simply saying is, it's better to be creative in how we fit within the current frame without abandoning our principles. If it's something that really is a particular threat, well, then that means quite a strategy to build the case that the government should change its mind. And there are loads of examples of that. Like, I've done quite a few over a good chunk of time, but it's harder work. It's more emotional, but it can be done. Absolutely. Yes, most of the time. Well, what do you mean, Chris? So, what I would say is typically for smaller organizations, it's more useful to partner with other organizations that have a similar view, of course, maybe in different geographies, maybe nationally, maybe in other parts of Ontario or other provinces, because that inevitably adds strength. It certainly a greater profile. It also creates an opportunity to use different political geographies to be able to engage decision makers. What do you mean? This is what I mean. Having an MP or a series of MPs in different ridings, some of which might be ministers, maybe not the portfolio that we care about, but a pretty influential one. Having that person in Sudbury versus that one in Charlottetown versus that one in Edmonton can help build the case for the minister that happens to be from Montreal to actually do something and completely revision, redo, reform, the policy that they were proposing. It's a lot harder when we're just like a smaller organization in one community that has a big issue. Let's say affordable housing. It can work in that if it's like a municipal type mandate or it's an elected official that has not just gravitas but maybe some responsibility in a as a minister or something, but typically it's better to make this a bigger issue and that the solution is a comprehensive solution. It's not just about us, it's about funding that will deliver this amount of impact and outcome, and address this much broader problem.
You alluded to this a little bit earlier when you were talking about that sort of, I guess, the more difficult way to persuade government was about long-term relationships, and I guess it would be helpful for organizations to know what they should be prepared to do on an ongoing basis, like making a commitment in terms of how they use their time and influence to maintain these relationships. What advice do you have?
So the first is like your contribution agreement, and what you're responsible for delivering, and your timelines and deadlines. That is the basic guide. So that if you're living up to your obligations, and you're not a problem for civil servants, and you're not a problem for political decision makers, that's a good start. It doesn't do all the things we need to do, but let's not dig a hole and make it worse. And I say that sincerely because many organizations I think do deal with this, and I will say government and its rollout of funding is often very inconsistent in timing, and there's all kinds of other challenges. I don't disagree, but I would say that is at a minimum what organizations should look to. But let's go further. So, maintaining a relationship with civil servants, those that are responsible for where our funding is coming from or that are relevant to our policy area where we operate, that's a really good thing to do. And so, how do we do that? Yes, it's meetings, Zoom or team meetings or Google, whatever. But it's also, information sharing. There may be data that we have that is pretty interesting and unique and important for them to know. It's not always about asking for more. In some cases, it's about like demonstrating, expertise, but also value. So I say that from a civil service engagement perspective. From a political perspective, a lot of that actually would be similar, but just mindful around the political lens that these decision makers have, which is, it's different from civil servants, no question. But political folks get involved in deep policy decision making, almost akin to like the ADMs, the directors, and the managers that we all have to deal with. So
And what about smaller organizations? I mean, they wouldn't necessarily have somebody who's dedicated to government relations work. How can they best use their rather limited resources to work with government?
So I think the strategy dictates how important it is, and then time and resources dictates what's possible. So when I say that, it comes down to, at a minimum, the civil service relationship, the one where we report to, that's something that is important. If we're getting 42% of our funding from this particular ministry or whatever, then you got to spend that amount of time out of 100% of time ensuring that that's fulfilled. It's as simple as that. Follow the money. If it's from a private, foundation or whatever, then they're the most important. So that's part of it. And so maintaining that relationship is around not just fulfilling our obligations, news that you can use, like sharing information that is probably useful for them, for their mind space, their head space, I think is something to consider. Um, for if we have the capacity, because we have a board that is engaged, getting board members to also participate helps to share that load. Engaging at a minimum our local representatives, to ensure that they understand what the organization is and does and what we deliver, is a good thing, because that may be helpful down the road for new funding that we weren't aware of. Or maybe we have a budget ask. We get funding every year from this particular ministry or department, but we have this brand bold proposal, and after a year of effort, maybe we're able to get something in the federal budget or the provincial budget or the municipal, the municipal budget even. So
And are there ways to secure funding beyond submitting the applications? Does having long-term relationships with different ministries help to identify and secure funding? Or is there a mix of strategies that is a good idea to contemplate doing if you're trying to maintain your revenue streams?
yeah, so absolutely, like maintaining a good relationship with your home ministry, department, agency, I think is number one. But that is not the end all and be all of government funding opportunity. There are other funding areas that are materialize where we may be able to envision ourselves doing something that's in a totally different area. Let's say seniors. Let's say affordable housing. We could spend time talking about that. But let me go further and say, you know, most folks, most smaller charities will look to the grants and contributions, the calls for proposals that are often out there, and will see that as the sole funding mechanism from government. Not bad. But another thing that you can do and you should think about, is looking at submissions to the as part of the budget process. Building a case for something is time consuming, but under the right conditions it can be extremely successful, and there are loads of examples where that's been done. Smaller charities led, by the way. So that's possible, but it does take time. Sometimes you have to go through a couple cycles, meaning the 12-month cycle is so it might be 24 months, but it is worth doing and worth pursuing. And it starts with at least having a good relationship with your home ministry, department, or agency. If you don't have that, well, you better just focus on that.
So, any final advice for nonprofits and charities across the country to ride out these enormous political shifts that we're seeing right across the country on many levels of government? Um, what would be your top tips for them?
So I think there's four things that every charity and nonprofit should do in this time, like recognizing federal government potential changes, provincial elections that are underway. So the first is, number one, assess your organization and your government relations strategy if you've got one. And if you don't, craft one based on the changing context. And what do you mean by changing context? The political tea leaves, the things that we all read about in the papers, but maybe it will happen, maybe it won't. But understanding your organization and determining what your government relations strategy is in this changing context, that's the number one thing. Number two, there is an opportunity to engage political parties, opposition parties, governments, with respect to platform commitments. Even at this late stage, it is possible. We just need to be mindful of the effort that'll take, but it is worth pursuing. So that would be number two. Number three is strengthening the relationships that we have with public service decision makers, civil servants. And what I mean by that is those that we report to, those that we have a funding relationship with. Why? Because they're the ones that ultimately will prepare the transition binders and materials for a new minister and a new government, no matter who gets elected. That's really important. And getting our material, getting our views incorporated in that is really, really important. And now is the time. And the time, by the way, is limited, meaning we have time now, but the moment that the writs are issued, when an election actually takes place, that's it. So now would be the time. And the last thing is recognizing that funding does come from government for many organizations, and it may be substantial. A big recommendation would be look to diversify your sources. That doesn't mean getting away from government funding, but what it does mean is if a government gets elected that's very fiscally conservative, and it doesn't matter if it's a liberal or conservative government, they all have gone through this. NDP governments have too. Be mindful that if that's likely to happen, that we need to be mindful of what other funding sources are available. So look to diversify our sources of revenue is something that I would also recommend. So those are four things.
Well, thank you, Chris, for your expertise and keen insight into this challenging period and your wise advice to nonprofits and charities across Canada. It's so helpful as we navigate these very uncertain times. Thank you for joining Charity Village Connects.
My pleasure, Mary. Very nice to see you.